Hey everyone, welcome back to the Caderna podcast. I'm your host, Brian Caderna. So in today's episode, I had a great interview with Gerald Posner. I'm going to give you his bio in a second. This was really informative, whether you're a writer or a creator or wanting to learn about these different historical topics that he's researched. It was a great conversation. I only wish we had more time. But who is Gerald Posner? Gerald Posner is an American investigative journalist and the author of 13 best-selling books, including Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK, Why America Slept, and God's Bankers. His latest book is titled Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. He was previously a litigation associate at the Wall Street law firm Kravitz, Swain, and Moore before leaving in 1981 to co-found Posner and Ferrara, a New York public interest law firm. Several years of pro bono legal representation on behalf of surviving twins of Nazi experiments at the Auschwitz death camp led him to co-author his very first book in 1986, Mengele, The Complete Story, a best-selling and critically acclaimed biography of the infamous Nazi angel of death, Dr. Joseph Mengele. This was a really great conversation where we go through the creative process, how he picks these different topics as an author, the years he spends investigating these firsthand and gathering raw data and then turning it into these best-selling books. So whether you're looking to learn about how to write better, how to think better about creating something, or if you want to learn more about these, different topics in these books, we spend quite a bit of time at the end on the latest one, Pharma, and how we can try and fix this huge pharmaceutical industry that has a bit of a bad rep, of course, in our country today, but on the same token, creates life-saving vaccines and does so much with the most advanced science in the world. So without further ado, please join me in this conversation with my guest, Gerald Posner.
Is going to require work and time and sweat and toil.
If money wasn't an issue, what would I be doing?
Don't worry about it. You'll figure it out.
Change is the only constant.
The Caderna Podcast.
Gerald, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be with you. I'm glad to join you and your listeners.
Yeah, thank you very much. And as I read your bio, it's a really cool journey. I mean, can we maybe start with how did you go from practicing law to now being a full-time author?
Well, you have shows about advice for people for finances that involve planning. And that journey from law to writing was without any planning. So sometimes the things that happen in life just sort of take place, right? Unexpectedly. If you had asked me when I was practicing law and you said to me, by the way, you're going to be an investigative journalist or you're going to be a writer, I would have said, not likely. Because what I do is practice law. But as you mentioned, I got involved in a pro bono case where you're giving your time, volunteering your time, representing a couple of twins who had been experimented on at Auschwitz, the largest concentration camp, by a Nazi war criminal who we thought was still on the run. And he was at that time, Joseph Mengele, the so-called angel of death. That sort of lit a passion in me. And although the lawsuit was unsuccessful, we got thrown out of federal court because you can't sue a foreign government in an American court for things that happened 40 years ago. I sort of had gathered thousands of pages of documents on this Nazi fugitive that nobody else had by being focused on it and eventually put into a book with a co-author from Britain. We gave some of the proceeds back to the twins, but that process, I loved it. Research, archives, chasing the stories, getting some truth that's not on the record. And I came back and said to my wife, Tricia, who's also a writer, I said, by the way, I've been in Paraguay talking to these people about Nazi war criminals, and it turned out that some of them were Corsicans who had fled France for being prosecuted. They've been indicted in a big heroin trafficking scheme called The French Connection, which was made into a movie. They wouldn't talk to me about Nazis because they knew that's what I was interested in, but they regaled me with stories about the heroin trade, saying things like, oh, by the way, heroin used to be a really honorable business, but it's been ruined because it's been taken over by the Chinese gangs. I kid you not. So I came back to Tricia and I said in 1988, 87, this period, by the way, these Corsicans in Paraguay believe that the international heroin trade's been taken over by Chinese gangs out of Hong Kong. Do you want to do a book about that? And she said, yes. So I knew I had found the right partner. And we went off to
Wow.
Southeast Asia. That became the second book. And you ask, how did I start to do it? We just never looked back.
That's awesome. And do you ever miss like practicing law, or was it one of those things where you're like, oh, thank God I did this?
I liked practicing law. So it wasn't as though I was one of those bitter lawyers who was saying always, by the way, I'd love to be doing anything but. Uh,
Yep.
I, I think law is a great background. The big practice of law at Cravath, Swaine and Moore, with that large firm that I was at, wasn't my cup of tea. That's great. If you're a large corporation, you need a firm like that. The small practice of law was challenging, but in the end, I couldn't do both. You'd like to think,
Mhm.
I know that the term is, we weren't using it back in the 80s, but multitasking. Everyone thinks they can multitask very well. It's very hard to multitask careers if you really want to do one super well.
So, and I just want to spend a moment there because I feel like a lot of people get caught kind of in that conundrum. Even myself, I got to be honest, I love writing, I love doing some of these other things, but my day job, if you will, as a financial advisor and having this big practice, it does seem like a juggling act at times. When you started to write that story about the twins, were you like, was it a clean break or were you doing that at night while you were still practicing law?
Yeah, no, I was still practicing law. I was still with a small law firm. My law partner, my late law partner, he passed away. He was extremely patient and kind to allow me to have that time to do it. And during the time that I was doing that, I just assumed I was going back to the practice of law. So it was the
Mhm.
type of thing where, I didn't sit down and say, I'm doing a career change. If I had realized how difficult it is sometimes. I mean, 13 books later, I know the ups and downs of publishing. I
Mhm.
know how fickle readers can be, how sometimes you do a subject that people are interested in. Other times you spend a couple of years and you're passionate about it. You're completely enveloped in the facts. You publish the book and few people are interested. That's the nature of this process that we pay our bills by here. So I never really sat down and said, this is it, I'm leaving the law. But by the time that I went to the second book, and it started to do the book about what I call the heroin trade called Warlords of Crime. By that point, I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to go back and practice. Now, I just paid the other day continuing, fee for New York State and for Washington, D.C., where I'm licensed to practice. I'm on the retired list, but I could activate the license again if I had to.
Okay.
But it's not something that I expect to happen in the next few
Yeah.
years.
Is that a just in case? Like if things hit the fan, you always got that?
Well, I think that even more than just the case, you put so much time into school, to law school, to
Mhm.
learn the craft of the legal profession, that to just abandon it because you think you're never coming back. I don't like the words when it comes to careers or that never, because sometimes people end up doing
Sure.
things they don't expect. And so if you earned the license, you went to law school, you passed the bar exam, you might as well keep the license for a few $100s a year. To me, it would be short-sighted just to abandon it.
Well said. And I want to ask you a few things, and then I'm definitely going to get into your latest book. Excuse me. But I find that, fear lots of times is obviously that barrier that gets us from point A to point B. And two things came to mind. One, did you have fear going from being a well trained, kind of high powered attorney to almost an entrepreneur, like a whole new thing of being a writer? And then as I was thinking about that, the fear of some of these things that you're investigating, it's not like you're just writing a fantasy novel. Like this is some crazy stuff that you write about. How did you deal with that? Or did you just find things you like and you plowed ahead and were like, man, I didn't even know what I was getting myself into?
Yeah, and no, you hit the nail on the head in the latter part. You pick a subject and you don't know where it's going to go, because the real way you should be doing a nonfiction book as a researcher is you find a topic that you like. Everybody has a sort of an inclination or bias going into a topic. People say, I absolutely have no feeling about something, but if you come into a major case, you're studying an assassination of a president, you're looking at 9/11 or whatever else, we all have a feeling about what we think happened. Then the
Mhm.
key is, as a researcher or writer, is getting a publisher to say, yeah, we're interested in putting your talent as an investigator on that subject. And then they unleash me to go ahead, in a sense, and investigate it and do the research, get into the archives, find the files that nobody else has looked at, and produce a book that's fresh at the end without knowing when they sign that book what I'm going to conclude. because that's the key. I think the mistake that a lot of writers make is they submit books to publishers with their conclusion. They say, this is my proposal. I want to write a book about X, Y, and Z because this is what happened. You don't know what happened until you research it. And sometimes the facts can take you in a completely different way. It happened to me on a book on the Kennedy assassination. It happened in an unusual way on a book on 9/11 in a different way. So I'm always open to following that information. And what happens is you get caught up in the passion of it. There's a fire that's lit on you. It's not just that you have a deadline coming up and you have to pay your bills. That's a good motivation, but the real motivation is the subject catches you on fire, and then you don't think about the consequences. What you were saying, is it dangerous? I was in Afghanistan in 2011 chasing a story down. Is there a risk to that? Yes, looking back, I can say that. Today, would I do the same project on the heroin trade where we went off to the Golden Triangle, one of the largest heroin producing areas in the world, and we met and hung out with young gangsters who were involved in the trade? At 30 years of age, that was fine. I'm not so sure I would do that today. So it is a bit of risk evaluation, but you're not, if you have that part of your DNA that makes you worried about a subject, or you're concerned about chasing every possible lead, you're not going to be a good investigative reporter.
Got it. Got it. And as you do these sort of things, I mean, there's so many different questions that kind of come to mind. I mean, I feel that as an author or an investigator, like, you're a human, you have certain inclinations, you have opinions on various subjects. When you start to go down your research, I feel like it's only natural that you gravitate to some things that maybe interest you or align with like your belief system. How do you handle either A, kind of not just going down one side of the tunnel, or B, starting to find out news or information that you don't like, that surprises you and goes against your belief? And then how do you write that? Like, you almost have to take that emotion out of it.
Boy, Brian, I think that's such an important question and realization, because a lot of people don't see that you go in, as you say, and you find information that goes against the grain of what you might have originally been thinking. And then the question is, how do you respond to that? Do you dismiss it? Do you put yourself in an echo chamber? Do you say, no, that can't be right, and find an excuse for dismissing it? Or do you say that could be valid? And one of the things that I had that's been a great advantage here is not just the legal background. Law helps a lot in this sense. You represent a client, but you also know how to argue the other side. I grew up on debate. I wasn't very great at athletics, so I wasn't on the football team or anything else. I was on the debate team in high school. I debated in college. I went into law in part because I was under the mistaken impression that law was all about debate. It's not just that, but I understand the other side of an argument. I appreciate what it is, and eventually I'm going to come to a conclusion about which side I think is right. But the information presented on the other side, I never view as a challenge to my own thinking, because I know I can be wrong going in. If you don't have that humility to think that you could be wrong, I'm amazed at people whose sense of ego is so great that they can start a project on a complex subject, have an opinion about what they think happened, and then say, and by the way, I'm not going to change my mind no matter what. Because if you don't have an open mind and you're not willing to look at contrary information, and so, I mean, just one little window, I went into, in the early 90s, looking at the Kennedy assassination, thinking, if you asked me what happened, I thought it was likely the mafia, because of Jack Ruby, the guy who looks like the nightclub owner in Dallas, who looks like he's out of a mafia movie, killing the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, 2 days later in police custody. That looks like every movie I've ever seen of a mob silencing. So that's what I was suspicious about. When I came across the information that indicated that was not the case, instead of doubling down and saying that can't be right, I was open to changing my mind. And so I always think that I respect people who can say, this was my opinion, then I investigated it, I discovered this information, and it led me to this conclusion. All too often nowadays, that doesn't happen, especially in this polarized political atmosphere that we're in. People go in their camps on the right and on the left. Nothing will change their mind. I see it all the time. I'm on social media, and occasionally I forget, and so I try to engage in a debate. but it doesn't go very far because people are not interested in contrary information. If you aren't
I know,
interested in
it's a
contrary
shame.
information as an investigative reporter, you're not going to be a very good journalist.
Yeah, I mean, that sense of humility, it's just it's kind of, I don't want to say it's gone, but obviously you see it every day in media, social media, etc. And when you go into these things, you keep an open mind, you start doing your investigation. Then at the end, do you feel like you have formed an opinion that is your conclusion? Or do you feel like you just kind of throw it all out there like, hey, here's the enlightening facts I found, make of it what you will? Or do you say this is like my fix or my conclusion?
Right. So I think that, and again, it's a very good question because it brings up two different parts of journalism. There's there's a part of journalism and writers and authors who continuously tell you in their finished works and in their books what you, the reader, should be thinking. I think that's a major mistake. I always assume present the evidence. I have a Substack called Just the Facts. So I'm sort of like, there used to be a television show when I grew up as a kid, Dragnet, and Joe Friday, the cop, used to say just the facts. And that's sort of my view of it. Present the facts, present what I've discovered, give source notes at the back of the book. I mean, Pharma has 200 pages of source notes for people who want to go and follow the information on why I made this conclusion, or a sentence in the book, or a footnote. And the reader can draw their own conclusion. It is clear, for instance, if you read my book on like 9/11, that I have absolutely no doubt that 19 hijackers are responsible for having pulled off that terrible attack on America, flying the planes into the World Trade Center and crashing into the Pentagon that day. I don't believe any of the truther arguments that the buildings were imploded and brought down by special explosives and it was a secret CIA operation. That's not where the evidence is. I have suspicions at the end of the book that I describe in an interrogation about whether some senior members of the Saudi royal family and one member of the Pakistan military might have had advance notice that something was going to happen on that day, but it's left as a mystery because we don't have the final information. So if you read that book, you have no doubt about what I believe happened, but I'm not telling you that. You're reading the book and you're coming to that conclusion based upon what I present is what I view as the real evidence. So there, I take myself out of the book, if that makes sense. The
It
books
does.
aren't about me. It's about trusting the reader to be able to go ahead and look at it and say, yeah, I have a sense of what happened in this area of history.
Did you ever have a book where you said, hey, I'm writing about this topic, and then the public took it in a whole nother direction that you didn't expect?
I mean, it's a good question. I've had books that definitely got a different reaction than expected. And so what I mean by that is that when we, meaning Random House, who was my publisher at the time, published Case Closed, my book on the Kennedy assassination in 93 on the 30th anniversary, the concern that they, the publisher, had and I had as the writer, was that nobody was going to care, because the conclusion was that in all likelihood, one assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, killed the president acting alone. That went against the narrative that most of the country believed, which was a conspiracy. Oliver Stone had done a film a couple of years earlier, JFK, which was sort of a kitchen sink conspiracy view, powerful film, bad history, but powerful film. And so Random House said, very few Americans think it's Oswald alone. So the people who think it's a conspiracy won't buy the book. The people who think it's Oswald alone, the smaller number, will say, I don't need to spend $20 to find that out. I already feel that. But what we didn't expect, when you say, did they take it a different way? The conspiracy theorists, those who think it's a conspiracy on JFK, viewed the success of that book, success meaning that it got great reviews in the New York Times and the major publications. It was up for a Pulitzer for history. It was a bestseller for the New York Times. That success said to the conspiracy theorists, that book and Posner, they must be part of the cover-up of JFK's murder. They've put out this book to keep everybody from finding the truth.
Oh my
So
gosh.
so my wife and myself, we were accosted on the street. I was assaulted on an airplane. We opened up the police file, received dead fish in the mail, got a rat's tail. People were aggressive. So it's not that they took it and did something different with the book that I didn't expect, but if you had said to me before publication, there's going to be this pushback. I knew people would disagree with it. I expected to debate that all day long. I'll sit down with anybody and debate the assassination and why I think this is what happened. But I didn't expect what I call that quasi-violent pushback that said, you are part of the cover-up. You must be working for the CIA. We're enraged at you. So,
Wow.
you never know.
Yeah, and there's a lot of crazies out there too. So that's a part of the job, I guess. And I want to come to your book in a minute, but is there a common thread that goes through your writings? Like, it sounds like a lot of things that some people might consider truth or conspiracy theory or things that are controversial. Like, do you have kind of like a passion, or do you just wait to see like what's that hot topic that people can't get enough of, and then you want to find the truth?
So I never look at the hot topic that people can't get enough of and figure I want to find out what the truth is, and that's why, for instance, you won't find me doing an Epstein book or something like that. Why? Not because it's not potentially interesting, but because it takes me 2, 3, 4 years. By the time I finish, a lot of other people have written about a hot topic issue, and the public is sick of it by that point. You come out with a book 4 years later and they say, oh, I don't want to hear anything more about that. I'm trying to find topics that interest me, in which I think there's still some new material to investigate that a lot of writers aren't looking at. Therefore, that's the attraction. So I did a book on Ross Perot. He was running for president the second time. There is an element of finding out the conspiracy of what was behind him dropping out of the race the first time and what had really happened. There was a moment after I ended up doing one book on the King assassination, in which it also had tremendous pushback. And I said, I'm going to take a break, not a break, but a break from these types of issues of political assassinations and politics and all, and do a book on the business of Motown Records, one of the greatest record labels ever, right? And sometimes nonfiction writers do that. So David Halberstam used to be a great historian. He wrote books about baseball. Doris Kearns Goodwin, who writes books about team of rivals, has written about baseball. So I said to Tricia, let's do a book about Motown. We both love the music and everything else. And she said, knowing you're going to discover that, I don't know, Stevie Wonder was lip syncing or that, or you're going to have the Motown people curious at it. As a matter of fact, what I did during that research is I debunked the conspiracy theories that Motown had been mobbed up, that the mafia had made Motown great, that Berry Gordy, who had been an inveterate gambler, had somehow been in debt to the mob, and the mob had made it great. Those rumors were around in the music industry forever, and it turns out they weren't true. Gordy made that business on his own with real talent. He had an amazing roster of talent. And so sometimes the things that you end up finding are not what I call the sensational story. And I think this is something, Brian, that a lot of reporters don't think of, or in this day and age when they want more clicks and to go viral. Sometimes the facts lead you, the evidence leads you to a conclusion that is not the tabloid headline. So, for instance, when I'm doing the work on Motown, the tabloid headline would be "Mafia Behind the Rise of Motown." That's going to get the headline and sell more books. But that's not what the facts show. So that's not where you print. You print the story that debunks it. The headline in the Kennedy assassination is to say that as a reporter, you found the incontrovertible evidence of a conspiracy in Cuba or wherever else that everybody else has missed for 30 years. That's going to get the headline. To come back and say, by the way, I think that the Warren Commission made a lot of mistakes, but they got the basic conclusion right, is not the sensational headline. So to be true to yourself as a journalist, you follow the story. You hope always, I'm always hoping to come up with a big story. Everyone wants to be Watergate, Woodward, and Bernstein rolled into one, but sometimes you don't get the sensational story. You get the smaller story. And if you're honest about what you're doing, that's what you publish.
That's very interesting. And a couple things I just wanted on the kind of the creative process, because this is very, very informative to me, especially as a writer. And I think anyone out there creating out there or investigating things can learn from it. Two things. One, how do you do all of this research? And the obvious question is now, are you using AI? And if so, how? And kind of a follow-up to that, which I can remind you if we come back to it. Do you ever question the evidence? Because I've even seen this where like I'll read something and then in a very reputable book, I'll be like, wow, that's interesting. I can't believe that. I go read the footnote. Okay, it's cited. And then I look at that actual source, and I find maybe that they are sourcing another source, and I go to that one and I'm like, what the hell am I reading now? And I'm like, wow, it went from kind of like who knows to like now a very reputable end product.
Yeah.
So
No,
kind of
you're
confusing.
no, you're absolutely right. First of all, I mean, I there's a major difference, and I think readers for the most part don't see this. As a writer, I know this, and I think a lot of other journalists know this. Some of them stick to this as a rule. There's a big difference between secondary sources and primary sources. So, secondary source is an article that says, "By the way, this happened," and then people will cite that as though it's fact. Give you a perfect example. I mean, I did a project for the New Yorker magazine years ago, looking into whether there was a John Doe to another suspect in the Oklahoma City, the Murrah bombing with the Timothy McVeigh. There's an article that was published in a Texas newspaper a few days afterwards that said a truck had been identified with a different license plate that belonged to a person, and this person had residue of the fertilizer that had made the bomb, and it looked like that was the missing suspect. You could cite that as a source for the missing suspect in the case, or you could go ahead and then do the hard work of finding out in the federal investigation what they had discovered. Did they really enhance it to see the license plate number? Was that really the person? Had they examined the truck? When you look into it in detail, much of that story in the newspaper falls apart because they're just reporting secondhand information. So it takes time to do it correctly. If you look at the back of the source notes in my books, they're often interviews that I conduct myself. In the Perot book, they're interviews with Ross Perot, the chief leading people around him. In the Pharma book, I go back to the original studies, to the actual studies that are published in, and look at the data inside of something. I go back to 10Ks. I go back to corporate filings, to interviews that are done. So in the Vatican book, which is about the finances of the Vatican, all of it is from original source material when you're talking about how they set up offshore corporations and move money to prevent wealthy Italians from paying taxes. You can't give this from a secondary source. And in the end, I own the accuracy of that, meaning this. If I'm referring to first sources, original sources, I've gone into the archives, I've used it, then I'm responsible for the accuracy of that. And if somebody comes back and says, hey, Posner, you cited this study as proving this, and it doesn't prove that at all, then I should be called out on that. You understand? Because I'm the one that's going back to that original source. And when you said, are you using AI? So we have, Tricia and me have a couple of book projects on the horizon, but we haven't yet launched the full next book project that we're going to test AI on that book project because I wonder now, when I've been in the past in this world of research, literally what we end up with, Brian, is we end up with a room full of boxes of documents. I go out, I make original copies. I like paper. I save things as PDFs, but I also take paper. I'm marking them up with yellow highlighters. And there's a point in the research, and literally one room in our 2-bedroom condo in Florida looks like a storehouse, a warehouse with boxes. Before AI, all of the connections to those documents are sort of up here. So I would know that if I was talking about a transfer that had taken place from an offshore bank to Panama with this Monsignor, that Monsignor had also been involved with a Swiss corporation that had been linked up with this other group. And then you have to go and you pull it out. I remember at one point on the finances of the Vatican, spending months on trying to figure out the financial manipulations in the late 70s and early 80s of the Vatican Bank, and saying to Tricia a number of times, I'm not going to be able to do this. I can't finish this. I can't follow these connections. It was so dense. Eventually, I managed to put it together and figure it out. But what I wonder now, of course, is if I had loaded all of that material up to AI and sent it into Claude or Chat or wherever, right, Perplexity, and provided the tens of thousands of pages of documents that I had pulled out of the archives and said to it, by the way, can you tell me how this transfer over to Panama ties to this Monsignor and this corporation in Switzerland? Would it have spit that out in 2 minutes and saved me 2 months of work? There's a hope that that will be the case. I will think back to a lot of books and realize that authors who are doing this in the future may be saved a lot of what I call that time spent in the background of trying to pull it together. And one last thing on this. People are accustomed today, especially researchers, and I see other journalists do it, to only doing their research online. They go on, they find a database, they do a search for it or whatever else. And I tell you, that's almost a surefire way to miss something, because not everything is digitized yet. And I love the fact that there are subjects that I work on where I have to apply to an archives to go and see the material. And I have to go out and actually go through it by hand. We put our gloves on, they're old papers, we go through them, and I see some connection on a document that might not have been picked up just on having it digitized. In addition, I've never made a connection with one whistleblower or deep background source that has provided key information on a book by a Zoom, by going on to Riverside or wherever else. You do an interview on, digitally, FaceTime, and you get the information. But when you do it in person, sometimes you get a connection with somebody. And after 3 or 4 meetings, they say, you know what? I have somebody else for you to meet. Or I'm going to tell you something else that leads down a rabbit hole that you could never get on the electronic connection. So my view is AI is fantastic. I intend to use it in the future as a research tool. I think that the fact that so many files are digitized now is a great thing. But the old shoe leather way of doing it, which is sometimes getting to an archive that hasn't yet been digitized, or doing interviews in person, I know that sounds like heresy to most people because nobody does it anymore, is the way to get great information as a reporter.
Yeah. And I think in some ways that kind of old school approach simplifies things, where I feel if you did use AI, like in your scenario where you put together 10,000 documents and said, hey, find the connection here, I feel it could create like a sense of paranoia of like, you got it. But then you're like, let me just go fact check the AI and make sure they didn't make a little mistake halfway through or misinterpret what I was asking. And then you're spending hours just, kind of confirming.
You're so right. I guess because, you're a creature of habit. And so I've been doing this now. The first book was published in 86. So it was, 40 years of publishing these 13 books. I can't imagine actually, although I say to you very, with a great expectation that AI will be able to figure out, for instance, the complexity of these items. I don't think I'm constitutionally capable of then sitting back and taking that AI answer and assuming that it was correct. I
Yeah.
would still have
like
to
a leap
spend
of
a
faith.
lot of time, right? To make sure that that was the case. So it's not going to just change it overnight for us.
With any of these stories, like if you had a missing gap or something somewhere, have you ever thought of doing historical fiction or even just straight out fiction based on some of these kind of, stories?
Yeah, I did actually. One novel is in there called Bioassassins, which is about a retrovirus that's being used by the KGB. So this is 1989. We were still in the Cold War against the Americans. It's sort of what I call a Tom Clancy type thriller, The Hunt for Red October. That was my third book. After the one on the Chinese tribes and the heroin trade, in which we had really risked putting ourselves at risk a number of times, we said, you know what, let's take a break, do a novel. That novel was for, at that time, McGraw-Hill. McGraw-Hill went out of the trade publishing business not long after that, not because of my novel, but just in general their decision. And by the time I went then to Random House, which was my next publisher, they were interested in a nonfiction book, and I've just taken nonfiction since then.
Gotcha. And it's funny because we went maybe a similar path where I worked with McGraw-Hill on 2 books ago, What Should I Do With My Money? And then they got out of like the business space shortly thereafter. So it's
the same. It
history.
forces you to look elsewhere. No, it's true.
It does.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I have to say one thing. Looking at your podcast tonight, you just did this great podcast on Steve Jobs in exile. And it made me think of something. We talk about books and research. In the summer of 1995, in August, and then later, a couple of months later, Trish and I were in Dallas interviewing Ross Perot for what would become a biography on him in 1996. And Perot had us in his office in Dallas, a big, wonderful office. And he told his 2 secretaries who were outside, I'm not taking any calls. I'm interviewing with the Posners. We taped it. He taped it. In the middle of one of those conversations, one of his secretaries knocked on the door and then came in, a rare interruption, said something to him. And he said to us, I have to take this call. And we said, you want us to go out? And he said, no, it's fine. And he was on just a couple of minutes and you could hear him say, that is great, Steve. That's really great. He gets off the call and he said to us, that was Steve Jobs. He's going to go back to Apple. that's going to be the best thing for Apple ever. Now,
You're
to
kidding.
show you how we were, this is such a fantastic, I think about this often. This is how I had the blinders on for a project. Trish and I left that office that day, and we were talking about the interview that Perot had given us. How does it fit in? Who do we talk to next? Should we talk to Ross Myers? And we need to get these documents? We were so focused on Perot. We never said, by the way, that's fantastic. Let's go buy some Apple stock. We,
Yeah, right.
that's why I'm still paying bills by writing for a living. So it goes to show you how the singular focus was that. And here we were witnessing this little window onto history, which was Jobs calling up Perot, who he liked, telling Ross that he was coming back, Ross passing it on to us innocently enough. And we were sort of like, oh, that's fantastic. And then back to the book.
You missed a whole nother story.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I've often thought about that. Boy, you want to know about how you have the blinders on a subject? That's how you have the blinders on a subject.
Wow, that's awesome. And again, I'm going to get to Pharma because I have a lot I'd like to talk on that. But just out of curiosity, because I find this career fascinating, do you have a favorite project, like one that you couldn't get enough of and maybe still kind of really sticks with you today?
So, so this will seem like an odd answer maybe, but the project that I'm doing at the moment, and I don't have it right now, it's not yet signed with a new publisher, that project becomes the one that I'm all consumed by. So if you say to me, when I'm working on Pharma, what's your favorite project of all? It's the drug industry. When I'm working on the finance of the Vatican, you say to me, what's your favorite project of all time? It's the finance of the Vatican. And if you don't feel like that, you're in trouble because you are working on it day and night sometimes. You're spending a lot of time to try to get information, sometimes a week of doing interviews or whatever that end up as a footnote. You understand? This is like slow, arduous work.
Sure.
And if you're not on fire on it, you can't fake it. You really have to be sort of consumed by it. And you are in many ways. Now, looking back, Trisha's, one of her favorite books is Killing the Dream, about the assassination of Martin Luther King, because the research for that was so fantastic. We had great original research in Memphis and tracking down people like mysterious Raoul and things like that. So sometimes it's the research that makes a book stand out for you. The Kennedy assassination, I mean, I remember at the end of Case Closed, when it had been very, very raucous, Trisha said to me at this moment, she said, I'm so glad not to be living with Lee Harvey Oswald anymore. That's the end of him. Little did she know that every anniversary he would be coming back, because every anniversary the conspiracy theorists are back at it, at the assassination files are being released. So some books never leave you, right? Nobody's calling me up to talk about the Perot book, for instance, because Ross Perot's long off their minds. So some books continue to come back into the discussion in ways that you could never have imagined when you did them 30 years ago.
And how long is the gap between, okay, I just finished this book that I've been slaving away on forever, to when you're going to do your next book? Do you give yourself a break?
So normally that gap is small, meaning that the book is out and I've signed a new deal within the next 12 months to know what the next book is. And then I'm working away on it. This time is the longest period in these literally 40 years that I have not yet signed a new deal with a traditional publisher since the publication of Pharma, which was at the beginning of COVID, March of 2020. And that's because we're working on two projects and we're researching both at the same time to get to the stage where we can go to a publisher. So at some stage, I will sign that deal. And then you'll say, how long was this new book in the works? And I'll say for 4 years, but 2 years of that will have been on our own dime, if that makes sense. Because what the publisher does is the publisher commits to the book in traditional publishing. They give you an advance. They give you a small part of the advance up front on the signing. They give you another part of the advance when you turn in like half the manuscript, another small part of the advance when you turn in the whole manuscript, and then the rest of the advance when they publish the book. So the money up front that comes in may not always be large, but it helps to pay the bills, the mortgage, and other things. This time we're doing that without that commitment from a publisher, because we believe that we'll get enough information to get a better advance if we go to them a little later. So that's how it works.
Got it. And do you feel like you do all that work, you come out with the book, and now you got this other idea that you want to pursue and you're all in? that you kind of shut the door on the old one? Like someone asks you a question, oh, I want to talk to you about this or do an interview. And you're like, nope, can't talk about it. I'm already on to.
No. So what's great is the period in which your book has been published, and you get to go on shows, book tour, podcasts like yours, television shows, and that's the period that is just the greatest. Because think about this: if you take an author who has spent a few years on a book project, and there is that moment at which you finish your manuscript, you think it's great, you send it off to the publisher, and you think, I wonder if the publisher is going to like it as much as we do. Tricia and me think it's fantastic. Then the publisher likes it. They publish it with enthusiasm. And then you wonder, I wonder if the public's going to be interested or not. You don't know. Now people come to you, podcasters, reporters for print, television producers, and they say, by the way, we want to talk to you about your book, the project that nobody has talked to you about for the past few years, that all your friends are tired of hearing about, that they don't want to hear any more about it. You can talk to us about it. And of course, you're enthusiastic about doing that. So, that enthusiasm, if I ever hear an author say, "Oh, I can't be bothered, I don't want to go and talk about my book," I think to myself, you're crazy. You've put all this hard sweat and effort into publishing a book. And if people don't know what's out there and what's in there, they won't have any opportunity to take a look at it. So I've never had an issue with the enthusiasm, and I'm always enthusiastic about my subjects. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but I am. So I had no problem in then talking about them afterwards, and having that enthusiasm and not being distracted at all about what's coming up.
That's cool, because it seems like a lot of different passions or interests that you kind of get so vested in that there would naturally be some kind of tug of war between them all. But it's almost like you have 13 kids there and you're proud of them all.
No, and it is interesting that I think one of the things is by the way, Trish just passed me a little note. We're good to 30, bottom of the half hour. Good. Sorry.
That works.
Just so anybody listening thinks that's odd. I thought I had a 45-minute hard break. I have another 15 minutes. That's teamwork.
Beautiful.
Thanks, Trish. I do think that I feel bad. For instance, Tricia had a book called The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, of this little known story about this Bayer country rep in Romania who gets drafted into the Waffen SS in the middle of World War II, and then is appointed to become the chief of the pharmacy at Auschwitz that's also responsible for dispensing the poison gas. Nobody had done this story. She found it. She did it. It was with a little tiny publisher in England, no advanced publicity, nothing else. Word of mouth made that book into a bestseller on the Wall Street Journal list. A year later, it's sold to 17 countries. Fantastic. Somebody calls Tricia up and says, by the way, I'd like to do an interview. She doesn't like it. She finds it like being back at school and taking a test or something. She's not comfortable in talking about it. She'll do it, but it's not her favorite thing. Whereas I actually enjoy it. I have an opportunity to tell you about what I've done and everything else. So I feel bad sometimes for authors who have done the right work. I see it with her, and they aren't comfortable in talking about the book afterwards. Not because they don't know their material down pat, they do. It's just that it's not, for some people, it's stressful. It's like public speaking.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is. And that makes sense. Like a lot of people, they just want to do the thing and not all that other stuff that goes around it. You see it even with athletes that could be amazing. And then they got to do a press conference and they're like, I got to get out of here. Like they're just not comfortable doing that part of the business. So your latest book, like you alluded to, is Pharma. And the subtitle here, I just had it in front of me and I lost it, but
Greed Lies in the Poisoning of America.
Yeah. A little bit of a kind of frightening subtitle. I remember that piece. And I just want to read a piece of the back of the book for some people maybe who haven't gotten to it yet. So pharmaceutical breakthroughs such as antibiotics and vaccines rank among some of the greatest advancements in human history. Yet exorbitant prices for life-saving drugs, safety recalls affecting tens of millions of Americans, and soaring rates of addiction and overdose on prescription opioids have caused many to lose faith in drug companies. Now Americans are demanding a national reckoning with a monolithic industry. What led you to this book?
So Pharma is actually a book, and I say that as a general topic, right? Without knowing what it would be like. Pharma was a book that I had wanted to do for a while, as was The Finances of the Vatican. There were two books that I sort of submitted as ideas after I finished one book on 9/11 or on the Saudis, and I would say, what about letting me loose on the pharmaceutical industry? And
Mhm.
publishers would say, no, it's too broad a subject. You'll be lost in it forever. Well, you'll never come back. What's the story? And I do think that's why I like tackling complex subjects. Maybe my legal background, maybe because when I was first at the Wall Street law firm at Cravath, they were representing IBM on an antitrust case. And there were a million pages of documents in the file. That didn't dissuade me. I sort of liked jumping into those. So I like complex subjects with a lot of documents. And so finally, I found a publisher that said, okay, look into the pharmaceutical industry. Now, what's fantastic, Brian, to me, we talked before about you follow the facts. I look back maybe a year or so ago at the proposal that I had submitted to them 6-7 years before that book came out. And in there, I mention OxyContin, I think in one small paragraph. Anybody who reads the Pharma book will understand that the narrative spine of that story, there's a lot of things in there from orphan drugs to pricing, to pharmacy benefit managers, to the coming pandemic. But the spine of the book are the Sacklers, Purdue Pharma, and OxyContin. So that became the story for me, not the only story, but an important part of the story, in part because I got Freedom of Information files on the Sackler family. I discovered through FBI files that nobody had ever known that the three brothers who founded the firm had been card-carrying members of the American Communist Party in the 1950s and had been investigated by the FBI for 20 years. A remarkable little thing for people who later became billionaire capitalists and on the 400 list. And and I was also, you said before, what are you enthusiastic about when you're in a book? I met with families who had lost children, relatives, spouses to opioids. And the conversations I had with those people, I have a story in there about the mother who wouldn't take no, who fought the Sacklers, and that those stories put me on fire, gave me a personal edge about it. So sometimes the story develops in a way that you don't expect it to. Pharma is a perfect example of that. And it is, as you said before, an industry with some amazing scientists working inside laboratories to come up with cures. And at the same time, there are public companies for the most part who have to hit quarterly numbers. And as a result, the marketing departments sometimes get too aggressive and they push drugs while hiding the side effects, much to the detriment of patients. So it's a tale of two cities, as Charles Dickens would say,
Yep.
good and bad.
And when the idea first came to mind, hey, I want to learn more about this and write about it. It seems like you going back to kind of that human element, like you have to be on one side. Like, were you going in like, man, I can't wait to dig this up and oust these guys and find these crooks?
No,
Or on the other side of like, hey, science is amazing and I can't wait to defend all these like.
So neither in this sense. That's why I think the book is good, because you read a chapter, for instance, about Jonas Salk and the polio vaccine, in which he's asked by, a famous CBS journalist, Murrow at the time, who owns the patent, because the patent is what allows the drug companies to sort of, in America, price it at their will. And he said, no one owns the patent to the polio vaccine. Who could own it? Who could patent the sun? That's one of those great examples of somebody who approached medicine as a quasi-public trust and is rare in the business. Those are great tales. The discovery of penicillin and how the American government spent tens of millions of dollars on a project to do it, and the pharmaceutical companies, nobody owned the patent. The prices were cheap. A great story. There are other stories in which there's greed involved and it's the worst possible thing. I did not want to, and I think this will make sense to you. The one thing I did not want to do was go in and tell a just bad pharma story, meaning that if you go to 10 people on the street, 100 people on the street, you ask them, what do you think of big pharma? I would think that the vast majority have a negative opinion. They either know drug prices are too high, they've heard some story, whatever else. I didn't want to do what I call an easy book that wasn't really an honest book, which was just to bash pharma all the time, because the real story is both. And what was unusual was I had a disagreement. I don't know if I've talked about this publicly or not. You may be the first person to have it. I had a disagreement with my publisher at Simon & Schuster about the subtitle, because the publisher helps to select the title. Very seldom do you really have that. So the title became Pharma. The subtitle, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America, to me, sort of tells you that the book is a bad pharma book. This is just attacking pharma. And it's more complex than that. The subtitle that I wanted, that I lobbied for unsuccessfully, was a history of the American pharmaceutical industry, or the history of the American drug industry. That put everybody at the publisher to sleep. They think that the word history is something that immediately scares readers off. It's a large book, and now you're telling them it's a history. That's really what it is to me. It has great stories in there and bad stories in there. And
Yeah.
there are plenty of reasons to condemn pharma over times for different things. But I always thought that I don't like to sell in the title or subtitle a view of the book that only hits one side.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking something like lives saved and lives lost, like something that like can make you both happy. Like, did you ever have a point where you're like, no, this is non-negotiable. I want this title, or you're taking me in a direction that's not representative of me?
Oh yeah, you can clearly. I mean, subtitles are harder to fight for because everybody thinks
Yeah.
of the title. So if the title that they wanted was "Evil Unleashed," I would have refused to have a book published for that. But
Got it.
at times, and then you think to yourself, because this comes back, publishing companies are in the business of making money. I understand that, so they want to sell books. So the marketing department inside the publishing company will come back and say, we've talked about this among ourselves and we've tested it with other people, and this subtitle gets people's attention. It draws people to the book in a way that it doesn't. You're hurting yourself if you don't use that subtitle. And then at some point you think to yourself, am I being too true to the idea of just a history of the American drug industry? Let them go with it and see if that helps. Now, of course, pharma in book publishing, they meaning publishers, do what's called a uncorrected bound galleys. It looks like the book. It's a big paperback of what the book will be. It's uncorrected. It hasn't gone through the final little bits of copy editing. And that is sent out months before, literally 3-4 months before, to reviewers around the country, like at the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Barron's, The Economist, all those places, in the hope that they will pick it up and do a review. They have to read it from that. It's also sent out to producers, the Today Show, Bill Maher, all those people get it early so they can make an early decision. Then the publisher wants to sell it for what's called first serial, to sell magazine rights to Newsweek, Time. That's the way they used to work. You get some advanced publicity. We've done that in the past. Then they have a set date for publication. So that's picked and set months beforehand. So March 10th of 2020 was the date picked for the publication of Pharma. The day after publication, the World Health Organization called COVID-19 a pandemic. Bookstores started to close down 7 days later. The book tour got completely scrubbed. Bill Maher, where I was going to be on, never got rescheduled. The trips to New York. That's the publishing business. You don't know, right? That was a rare example. But the book, no one wanted to talk about the Sacklers and OxyContin then. They wanted to talk about COVID and virus, which was fine. My second to last chapter is called The Coming Pandemic. The word COVID's not mentioned in my book because it was published before COVID. So it's an unusual time. And it was also odd because people, as you remember, in the beginning of COVID, tremendous amount of fear, uncertainty. People aren't sure what's happening. And they don't necessarily want to spend their spare time at home reading a story about the intricacies of the pharmaceutical industry. So that's the nature of publishing. Sometimes you publish at the right moment and sometimes you publish at the wrong moment. You have no control over it.
Yeah, and timing's everything. But on the actual content of this book, I wanted to ask you, I mean, we've all heard so much about the opioid epidemic that you said was kind of like the spine of the book. Was that something that you think is kind of like an outlier, like a huge black mark in history? Or was it something that's a predictable result of incentives that we could see occur again, as you talk about like GLP-1s or whatever the new thing is that, do you see it maybe reoccurring?
But I mean, it does play out time and time again. So what made OxyContin or the opioid epidemic different was that it was lethal. It wasn't just side effects. But in the book, I talk about the fact that this is sort of pharma's MO. I mean, in the 60s, Arthur Sackler was the person who did the publicity for Hoffman LaRoche on their new drug Valium, made it the number one selling drug for 15 years in a row, the first billion-dollar drug. It set records. And it took a decade before Hoffman LaRoche and others started to talk about the addictive qualities of benzodiazepines. In the 60s, there were methamphetamines, there were diet labs all over the country. And it wasn't until there was started to be diversion and people getting addicted to methamphetamines that they started to roll back. When the first hormone replacement therapy came out and was marketed toward women by a gynecologist in New York who did a book called Forever, Feminine Forever, sponsored secretly by Wyeth, they hid the fact that the hormone levels were so high that women were dying of blood clots and getting, endometrial cancer. That took a decade to come out, but they were selling it as one of the biggest selling drugs in the country. So the sort of what I call the DNA of pharma is you get a hit drug. Sometimes it can be diverted because it can be abused, like methamphetamines or benzodiazepines. They overmarket it, they oversell it, they ignore the side effects, they push it off as long as possible. With OxyContin, the results were often lethal, but it's not a one-off.
So you think that we haven't really learned our lesson, that this is the
There will
system,
be
it's going to happen again?
right, and GLP-1's a perfect example. Not that they're killing people, but we have a test market going on. The FDA requires them to submit clinical trials. That's fine. The biggest clinical trial on GLP-1s are the tens of millions of people using it.
Sure.
Not just for morbid obesity, in which it can save your life and bring down your numbers and make you healthier and not make you a diabetic, but people are using it because they're going to some awards event in Hollywood and they want to lose 10 pounds.
Yeah.
We're going to find out in the future what the long-term side effects of those are. And the real question becomes, and this is what I learned in pharma, are those reports filtering into the FDA or filtering in as adverse effect reports to the manufacturer of the drugs? And are they passing them on to regulatory authorities, or are they pushing to the back of the list? That's the mistake that pharma companies made in the past. I don't know about GLP-1s because I haven't investigated it, but whether it's GLP-1s or something else, there will be some eventual pharma scandal that you'll say, by the way, haven't we seen this before?
And to that point, like your book came right out of COVID. Like, did you have an opinion on the vaccine? Because I know it seemed like the universal fear for people that were on that camp.
So I'm leaving you just with this because I have to unfortunately cut off. My
That's
view on
fine.
vaccine, I take the vaccines from a money perspective. Forget, for instance, for their efficacy for a second. What drove me crazy about the vaccines is I wanted to use the penicillin model. Government pays for the vaccines, billions of dollars, which we did. And then nobody owns the intellectual property rights. In this case, we paid billions of dollars for these companies like Moderna and Pfizer and others to develop the vaccines. And then when they did, we let them keep the intellectual property rights so they were able to make tens of billions of dollars in profits. That to me is unfair. They're entitled to a fair profit. There's no doubt about it. I'm a capitalist. I understand that. But if the government's funding the research on a crash program, the public should get the benefit of the companies essentially doing it as a quasi-public service.
Got
That's
it. Well said. Yeah, and this was awesome, Gerald. I really appreciate your time. I know you have to run, but where
Thank
can
you.
people find you or follow you if they want to?
I'm on Substack at Just the Facts by Gerald Posner, and I'm on all the regular social media sites, LinkedIn, but also on Twitter at Gerald Posner, where I comment on quite a few different matters during the day and try to keep it as journalistic as possible.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Gerald. And everyone, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Caderna podcast. We will see you next time.
Thanks, Brian.
This podcast is intended for the general public and for informational purposes only. The show does not provide any recommendations or investment advice regarding any specific account type, service, strategy, or product, or to otherwise act in any fiduciary or other capacity. Please contact a financial professional for guidance and information that is specific to your situation. Brian Caderna does not provide tax or legal advice. Please contact your accountant or legal advisor to discuss your situation. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by Park Avenue Securities, Guardian, or Caderna Financial Team, and opinions stated are their own. All investments contain risk and may lose value. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. References to specific securities, asset classes, and financial markets are for illustrative purposes only and do not constitute a solicitation, offer, or recommendation to purchase or sell a security. Brian Caderna is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, PAS. OSJ 300 Broadacres Drive, Suite 175, Bloomfield, New Jersey, 07003. Phone number 973-244-4420. Securities products and advisory services offered through PAS, member FINRA SIPC. Financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. PAS is a wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Caderna Financial Team is not an affiliate or subsidiary of PAS or Guardian. California Insurance License Number 0K04194.